What is your main motivation for seeking a seat or another term in your seat on the Laramie County School District 1 Board of Trustees?
Yes, well, thank you for having me here today, and I know I'm one of two who are running for the board, who are running for re-election. And my main motivation remains our kids first. And when I say that, I mean we have significant needs in improving our growth and our proficiency outcomes in our classrooms with our students. And it's actually across the board. And that was a motivation when I ran initially, and it remains so. I have been a part of redirecting district funds toward early reading literacy, and I'm very proud of that. That was one of my goals, and to the credit of my other board members, we all unanimously voted to do that. And the new superintendent has also been directed by us to work on growth and proficiency outcomes for our students. So I know that she is undertaking that task very seriously at the direction of those of us on the board that care very deeply about that issue. Another issue that motivated me to run is our parents. I am a parent of 3. I have a vested interest in our district, and I understand the parent concern. We've had some tumultuous years recently where parents have come and they're passionate about their students' experience at school. And I am a person that understands that because I'm a parent. And so I feel like I'm very open to listening to different voices in our community and representing them from the dais and really understanding their perspective. And I think that parents are fed up, just to elaborate a little more, I think they're fed up with what they see as agendas. And I also think that they want politics out of the classroom. And that's something that I feel is important to listen to and to ensure that we are, as a district, providing that accountability to them on those issues. And then my third reason for running is really to support our staff. We have tremendous teachers and support staff and administrators in our buildings, and they're on the front lines, and they need help. They're spread thin. They're in small buildings or old buildings. They're being asked to do more and more. Behavior is an issue for them. Growth and proficiency, they're trying to improve those test scores on the ground, in the classroom, and they really need professional development, and they need resources. We need to be gearing our efforts and our money toward those types of initiatives. So those are the 3 primary reasons that I feel like it's important to stay on the board and continue to fight for those things.
And let me follow up by asking, you're running specifically for the Area 3 seat, which is essentially the Central Triad. Why that seat and not the at-large seat that's open this year?
Well, I live in the Central Triad right now. I did live in the South Triad when we first moved here for a couple of years. Most of my connections, though, I think are primarily in the Central Triad because my kids go to school there. So that was my primary motivation.
Okay, very good. Paulette?
If you are elected, how would you make sure you are considering the needs of all constituents?
Well, thank you, Ms. Gavin. I appreciate the question. It's actually going to be very different for me this time to run in the Central Triad because I've served on the board for 4 years and have represented all of our constituents, and I really don't see that changing. It's not appropriate to be on the board and only represent one area. Of course, I'll be happy to take those calls, those emails from our constituency in the Central Triad Area 3 and voice those concerns. But I would do that for anyone who contacted me, and I do that for anyone who contacts me. It's important to note that as a board member, you're not there to get involved in interpersonal relationships or staffing issues, you're really there to direct those kinds of things back to your school, your local school, or if it needs to be to your superintendent or the administration. The board really takes on policies, and so when I hear from constituents, I'm always thinking about issues from that lens. Is this a policy issue that needs to be addressed on a district-wide level? So that's where I would say the consistency would continue in representing all of the constituents and all of our stakeholders, from our littlest kindergartner to our oldest child, to our administrators, to our teachers and support staff.
Question three. What do you think the relationship between the board and parents should look like?
I have always believed, and this is why I'm on the board, I'm a parent, I've always believed that relationship is vital. You can't divorce the student from the parent or family unit. They're one. And that is very important, that we listen to our families and their needs, that we make provisions for them when it comes to them objecting to content or having special needs or requests. We are serving them in the area of education for their child. And so I think that's very important, that we're responsive, that we, again, think about good policy that provides options for everyone, and that we're respectful. So I think I've answered that question.
What should the rules of engagement be at school board meetings?
Great question. I know that's been an issue lately. I really feel like we're elected leaders, and the purpose of the board is to be the public representatives in the school district. And so as elected leaders accountable to constituents, I think it's important to listen to anyone who's interested in reaching out to the board. Now that might be through email or a phone call, but it also might be that you really want to come and speak to all the board at the same time, and that would be through our public meetings. And we do have public comment periods, and I think that I've been on the board where we've done that differently in different times. I think it's important to allow people that are willing to come and their busiest part of their day when their kids are getting home or maybe rushing around from sports or activities, trying to cook dinner and get homework done, and they're willing to come, that we should give them an opportunity to speak to the board. I do think that it's okay to give them a finite period in which to talk, and I do think it's probably prudent to get their name and contact information in case there needs to be follow-up. But in addition to that, I have no objection to listening to whoever comes to our meetings.
Do you think the registration in advance is good, and is that time period good for people to need to contact the district? I think it's 24 hours before the meeting or whatever the current requirement.
I would stick with my original answer. I think that if you didn't register ahead of time, you shouldn't be penalized.
Okay, sounds good. The next question is, do you think K-12 schools in Wyoming are adequately funded? And if not, how would you recommend the legislature address the issue?
I think that I can't speak for other schools in the state, but I do think that LCSD 1 has a lot of significant needs. We have one of the largest, if not the largest, school district in the state. We have a growing population, and we have very old buildings, and our old buildings need to be updated or replaced. And I think that our legislative delegation here in our area, I know I've asked our superintendent to be in touch with them, take them to our buildings, show them the conditions in which some students are being asked to learn. We've got reading interventionists meeting in closet space. We've got band meeting in the back part of a stage during lunch, in the cafeteria. I think our administrators are very creative, but we're a fast-growing city, and we need to make sure that we have room for our students and that we have adequate facilities. And other kinds of funding stressors. I know we cut elementary sports during a dire forecast of our budget. And then COVID hit and we got all this federal funds. Of course, we can't use that for elementary sports. But, you know, we need to be looking at the funding issue and address, I think we have some real legitimate issues here in LCSD 1.
Right. I know it may be difficult because you're on the board now to ask the question, but I'm asking all candidates, do you think LCSD 1 should join the Wyoming Education Association lawsuit to press that issue?
You're not going to like my answer. My husband is working on the, it's his job to work on the other side. He works for the state. And so I have had to recuse myself from this issue, and I can't weigh in because I have a conflict of interest.
Sure. No, that's valid. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
As a board member, what would be your budget priorities for the district?
That's a great question, and I've been consistent on this for the last 4 years. I've mentioned already the early reading literacy has been one of my projects that I really pushed as a new board member, because as a substitute before I went back full-time, and I know you know this, Ms. Gatlin, that you run into students all the time who are not reading at grade level. And it is discouraging because you know the statistics. If you're not reading at grade level by 3rd grade, you're really set up for some hardships and failure in a lot of ways going forward, not only in your classes above 3rd grade, but also in life in general. So that's been a real priority, and I would like to continue to see the district put efforts and resources there. I also think that resources in the classroom, which I think I mentioned a few minutes ago, the best possible learning environments for our students, and that gets into facility issues as well, and the best possible working environments for our teachers. We ask them to go into these buildings every day, and we need to make sure that we're focusing on safety and security as well, because we all deserve to have a safe place to work. And I think we need to address behavioral issues better, because we have a lot of students who need to work on that. And it's not fair to teachers to be bullied by students because of TikTok challenges, or students to be bullied by other students. And that gets into mental health issues and anti-bullying initiatives. And they're all related. They're all related in producing the best possible environment for our students to learn and our teachers to work. So I would say all of those are my top priorities, because if we're not doing education, then we're really not doing our job. Mm-hmm.
Next question has 2 parts. How do you feel about increasing teacher compensation? And if you agree salaries need to be increased, how would you find the funds to do that?
That's a hot topic. I think that LCSD 1 has had above average salaries for our local, when you compare them to states around Wyoming, for a long time. But that's no longer, I think, the case from what I've heard. And I think it's important for us to stay competitive. So I do feel that we need to pay our teachers competitive salaries. We're facing a teacher shortage, and we need to make sure that that is part of our discussion in trying to recruit and retain teachers. I mentioned environment too. That's really important for good working environments for our people, to keep them, including our administrators. But getting back to your question, as far as how to solve that issue or how to find funds, salaries is one of the largest budget items for our district. And it's not like you can adjust something, in the small piece of the pie to make up for this huge piece of the pie. It really is a state issue, and I think it requires the legislators being aware of what competitive salaries are around our state, and for them to take action. And as I mentioned about our facilities, that's another issue that we need to do some educating as LCSD1 on what is competitive salaries. How long has it been since we've given an ECA, and make sure our local delegation of state legislators are aware of the needs we have.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
How much freedom should teachers have with regards to the district's curriculum?
That's an interesting question. I think that it is important to talk about the process for developing curriculum. The process for developing curriculum is one that is very intentional, and it is developed by our professional staff in our administrative building, but I think that they do that in consultation with our teaching staff as well, who have expertise in the areas specific in teaching different areas. Sorry, I just repeated myself. Will you edit that? Let me say that one more time. You can just edit this part. I think it's an important question. I think that we need to talk about the process first. The process we have in place is for our administrators and our teaching professionals to come together and to develop curriculum. And then when they do that, they're thinking about meeting state standards. And that's very important because our students are tested based on those state standards. And then from there, they make proposals for curriculum, which go out for public review for 45 days. And that's a very important process too, because I believe very strongly that we need to be transparent with our community in what we're offering for curriculum. And then after that process, then the Board of Trustees is asked to vote for the curriculum and adopt it. And that's an important process too, because as I said earlier, the Board of Trustees represents our community, and so having that vote is representative, is the kind of the final phase of representing our community. So when it comes to freedom to change the curriculum, I don't think that that's necessarily a good idea. Now, I'm not saying that it's not good to have flexibility in how you teach the curriculum, because every teacher is going to have a different approach. But when it comes to curriculum, we have a very transparent process, and we need to keep it transparent so that we maintain trust and accountability with our stakeholders.
How do you feel about the teaching of racial discrimination as part of U.S. history?
Well, that's an interesting question, too. There is a national conversation I'm aware of teaching racial discrimination, which gets into all kinds of other issues. But then there's also the teaching of actual factual events that occur in history related around racism. So could you clarify the question?
It's broad kind of intentionally, so how do you feel about teaching, should racial discrimination, which is part of our history, be taught in our public schools? And if so, how do you think it should be taught?
Okay. I do think that we should teach the history of the United States. And in that, I do believe accurate accounts for racism is appropriate and should be discussed. I'm actually a history major, and I also have a master's in history, and I think that you can't learn from the mistakes of the past unless you teach them and talk about them, right? But I would also say that it's equally important to teach and talk about the progress we've made on the issue of racism. We've had the civil rights movement. One of my heroes, Martin Luther King, great man who pretty much single-handedly changed, or started a movement that changed the course we were on. And I think it's very important to celebrate those successes, to talk frankly about challenges we still have, but to acknowledge the work that we've done in that area, because I believe in the ideals of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and they give us hope, and they bring us together as a people. We're not necessarily always going to be able to celebrate that we're there, but if we can say we're on our way and we've made progress, and here's where we came from, which was a really negative past, but that we have a bright future if we continue to work toward those ideals in our founding American ideals.
You started answering the question by mentioning a national conversation, and I know as a board member you've heard some of that in the past 4 years. What's your perspective about the national conversation about this issue and critical race theory and that kind of controversy that's been brought into the local school board setting?
Well, that's what I was wondering if you were asking about, because I think that is not a K-12 issue. It's a theory. It's my perspective is it has undertonings of Marxism that run counter to democratic values, and I don't adhere to teaching our little ones that our system is fatally flawed and that they would, not have a chance in life. I think that's defeating and harmful.
Do you support an opt-in or opt-out policy for kids checking out books from the school libraries, and why?
Yes, thank you for asking me that question, because boy, there has been a lot of misinformation out there on this one. I'm going to give just a brief history. A couple of years ago, there was a book that was challenged in one of our elementary schools by a family, and it dealt with an issue they didn't want their student reading. And at the time, we didn't really have a system of opting in or opting out. So I actually went to the English language coordinator and I said, what can we do for parents that are interested in opting out of books like this, or any book? And we developed, she and I had a conversation, she developed a form, I brought it to the board and we adopted it. And it gave parents choices to opt out of genres. It gave parents choices to opt out of titles and also authors. Then this last year, earlier this year, we had some parents come to our board meeting and they read out loud some passages that were so sexually explicit and graphic that they had to be stricken from the video because they were not deemed appropriate for K-12 audiences. So my first initial thought was, why are we offering that kind of content in our schools when we have dress codes and we have language, barriers where you can't use obscenity, and we have all kinds of filters on our school computers to prevent accessing sexually explicit content. So I asked that question, and turns out, after meeting with our library professionals, that we get these books in, and they do use professional resources to review them, but you can't necessarily search them by a scene that is graphically described in the book. So you might want to opt out of a genre like horror or drama or whatever, but you might not be able, that might not catch a book that has a passage in it, 5, 15 pages, whatever, of a scene depicted through words of sex acts that are pretty explicit and I would consider adult content. So therein lied the problem. So I asked about an opt-in policy for those particular books. It has nothing to do with genres, it has nothing to do with themes or topics, personal preferences or lifestyles. It has to do with, are we as a district going to be consistent in our policy? Are we going to be accountable to parents that we're going to put some kind of parental consent on accessing adult content that's sexually graphic for minors? Or are we just going to, hope the parent knows about it and then also happens to know the title and the author of the book? Because at this point, they can go in and meet with the librarian and say, And our professional librarians are wonderful. They're going to want to work with us as parents. Our administrators are going to want to accommodate the requests of parents. But we don't have a system in place, and this is, again, my mind thinking policy. We don't have a system in place that's going to capture necessarily a book that has a scene that's graphically and explicitly describing sex acts, unless that librarian happens to know about that book. And right now we don't have a policy to have those librarians identify those books. That's what I wanted to do. I've been told by different parents that are concerned about this issue that we're talking about a few dozen, I'm not quite sure how many books, but we have over 350,000 books in our library system. So this is not a big job. This would be to look into our young adult books and try to identify using outside resources, professional resources we already consult with, but maybe resources that might be looking for these kinds of passages, to identify them and put them in an opt-in where a parent then could say, hey, school, I'm okay with, my son or my daughter reading this book with this scene in it. But I just felt it was the more responsible way. It gave parents another choice. It put the onus on the district, saying we're providing this adult bookstore type of content in this one scene in this book, and if you're okay with it, then we're okay with it. But I really feel like it's irresponsible for us not to address the issue. We are serving minors, and this is graphic and explicit sexual content, and I just don't think that we should be offering that without parental consent.
Thank you.
So just to clarify on that, it sounds like you're for somewhat of a hybrid, an opt-out and an opt-in?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and that's, that's been, the dialogue has been, well, a lot of people have been reacting to what I think they think is a national issue and what might be going on in other places. And maybe people are aware of those books and have asked if they're here and they realize they are here. Maybe that's where it came from. I don't know the source. But I'm just thinking practically about the policy.
You can go ahead and ask the.
Very good. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure.
Yep. Sorry.
Yeah, and I've got the final scripted question.
Okay.
And what should the process be for changing policies in the school district? Do you agree or disagree with the current process, and why?
Changing policies. The current policy, the one we've followed since I've been on the board, has been to have different policy committees and to bring ideas and changes based on, usually there are issues that come up throughout the school year and they think, oh, we need to tweak this or tweak that. I do think that our new superintendent is interested in changing some of that up and having our now in-house legal counsel go through our policies and make sure that we're to code with state statute and also state regulation. And I think that's a good thing. I do think that we still have accountability to our stakeholders because we have our parent advisory committee that policy suggestions are run through and run by. We have our public comment on any changes to policy that allow any one of our stakeholders in our community to weigh in with concerns or suggestions. And then ultimately, policy is voted on by our publicly elected board members. So I think that it's a good process, it's transparent, it's accountable to our stakeholders. And those are my high marks, those are my standards that I usually look for when I'm thinking about those kinds of things.
And there are proposed changes. I think that the comment period is closing on Friday?
Mhm.
Everyone?
For the first two chapters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So do you agree with those changes that are coming? I mean, probably can't answer because you're going to vote. But I guess maybe your perspective on what you've heard or those proposed changes.
I think I can answer.
Okay.
I hope I can
answer.
Yeah, I don't want to.
You're going to be voting on Monday.
I'm thinking
so
on
yes.
hard now.
Yeah.
No. Yeah, I think I can answer.
Sure.
That's a great question, and I am in agreement with the changes because of what I just said. And it kind of goes back to another question that I answered earlier. You know, I gave some thought to the change from the policy committee and the new proposed change to do away with that. And I asked questions internally with the district on what was the thinking about that, because I sat on that committee. But because I sat on that committee, I might have a slightly different perspective. That committee was made up of a couple of board members, a couple of principals, a couple of CTEA representatives, a couple of PAC parents, and others. But we were not necessarily experts in curriculum or experts in special ed or experts in transportation. Well, no, that was a different committee. Experts in different areas, right? We were sort of generalists or had opinions. And I think it's probably wise to have the policy suggestions come from people who are actually doing the work and familiar with the research and have a good grounding in the content. And they come to then the parent advisory committee, they go to the public, and they ultimately go to the board in those settings for others to sort of consider what they're proposing and why they're proposing it, and then weigh in. So I do think that that's probably a positive, because you're going to get more useful suggestions in some cases. You know, it's not that what we suggested was rubbish by any means, but I wouldn't pretend to have that expertise in some of these areas that they might.
I'm just curious, Christy, since you've served on that committee, were those policy changes suggestions brought to you for review, or were you being asked to create policy changes yourself as a member of the policy advisory committee?
Yeah, it was kind of a hodgepodge in my experience, so this is just my experience, but we would come together and we usually meet for a couple of hours, and maybe the former assistant superintendent for instruction would recommend to us, you know, this issue came up with a parent complaining about the process here, and we'd go to that section of the policy and we'd read it and we'd decide, oh, well, you know, we could reword it this way, or we could change this word or clarify it. And it was very much wordsmithing. Or we might try to add a section, but we might add it using our intellect, and not that we weren't smart people, but we didn't come with that expertise of, oh, well, we need to use this specific language because it's legal, it's a legal term, or something like that. So I think that my knee-jerk reaction initially to the change was like, wait. But then when I thought about it and I asked some questions and I looked at it from the perspective of having better recommendations, I think that from my experience that will happen.
Okay, thank you. Mm-hmm. We want to just give you time to address any other issues that you would like to share with us that were not in the questions that we had prepared. Anything else that you would like us to know about you, your service on the board, your objectives for the next 4 years if you're reelected, that sort of thing?
Oh gosh, there's so much to say, but I won't belabor it. I think that, you know, my primary goals are what I've stated earlier, but you know, at the top of the list is improving student outcomes. Sorry, I just looked at the camera, darn it. I would say at the top of the list is improving student outcomes, growth and proficiency rates. It's an obvious thing that I think every candidate running knows we need to address, and our district knows it, and our current school board is committed to it. So that's if we're not doing education right, we're doing a disservice to our community. So we really need to get that right and figure out how to improve those scores and proficiencies. I would say that safety at school and security, again, are top priorities. We need to keep our buildings safe. We need to keep our students and our teachers and our staff inside those buildings safe. I really appreciate the crosswalk guards that are there, making sure our kids are getting across the street safely every day, because of, we shouldn't lose anyone, and we had a terrible tragedy at McCormick Junior High last year. And then I want to also say, I've not commented on this, but safety and security isn't just physical safety and security, it's also emotional safety and security. And I really believe in the district-wide policies that we have in place for anti-bullying, no tolerance for racism. And speaking to that, we did, as a board, just pass a resolution on racism and no tolerance for racism a few months back. And I think it was unanimous and we all agreed. But that's important too, is making all of our kids, no matter who they are or what they look like, feel comfortable in our buildings and respecting their differences, respecting their different backgrounds. I said earlier in my comments, we can't divorce the child from the family. Respecting the values of each of our families, and they're diverse. And that gets into a third issue of needing to be transparent with our curriculum, needing to avoid agendas, needing to avoid national agendas, which do seep down into our district at times. And I'm not a person that's afraid to have that conversation. I think that if people are bringing it to me because it's here or it's their experience, I'm not going to say, oh, that's a national agenda, so I'm not going to listen to you, constituent. No. If I feel like it's worthy to have a conversation about, then I think it's worthy to have a conversation about. My whole thing in the last 4 years is to be civil. My background is policy. I'm used to talking to lots of people who have a difference of opinion with me, and I'm very comfortable in that space. I respect different points of view, and I think that we're better when we listen to each other and talk to each other. I think we can do that. I think we're grown up enough to do that. And I think that parents are, they're concerned about these things, and they want transparency, they want accountability. And in my role as a board member, I was looking back at my platform when I first ran. It's very consistent with what I've done this last 4 years, and it's still my platform. I've added a few things, but really it's about making options, creating choices for parents and students, respecting everyone involved, all the stakeholders, listening to our stakeholders, and civilly engaging people on issues, sometimes really tough issues. So I think that's probably what I want to leave you with.
Other follow-up questions from the board?
I've got one.
Sure.
So kind of encapsulating some of what you just said in terms of like the no tolerance for racism,
Yeah.
and the the production of Bill of Rights things. I know that you've listed in your accomplishments, not including hate speech in the discipline matrix. And how do those two things kind of relate, and how do kind of those First Amendment protections also relate to these issues with the books in terms of the First Amendment rights regarding access to content?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking me that. I have never tried to ban books, not once. And I think I explained that earlier, but I have tried to do what we do consistently throughout the district, and that is identify the however many 50 books we have with sexually explicit content describing sex acts, and put them in a category where we get parental consent. That means that that book is not banned. It's still accessible. You just have to get mom and dad's approval. And I think the parents I've talked to, they're okay with some of these books, and that's fine with me. But they want to know that their daughter or son is reading it so they can have that conversation. Hey, did you get to this part yet? So I'm glad you asked that question, because I didn't say that earlier. And then as far as the hate speech, that was an initiative by a coordinator that we had that isn't working for the district anymore. But and it showed up at a board meeting and said, we're going to put hate speech in the discipline matrix. And my first question was, well, what do you mean by hate speech? Because everyone sort of has a different definition for almost every word in the English language, it seems like now. And it's important to talk about these things. Let's get on the same page, let's understand each other. And they were proposing that, you know, if you said something that was considered offensive to someone else, that might be deemed hate speech, and then that would go into your record and follow you. And I think that it needs to be, when we are talking about those kinds of issues, whether it's hate speech or something else, we need to be transparent. We need to have that conversation at the community level. We need to have clear and defined definitions. And we need to make sure we're not accidentally hurting children by labeling them. Yeah. So that was my thinking.
Any other questions? Follow-up? Christy, thank you so much for being here. We really
Yeah.
appreciate it. Thanks for running for re-election.
Thank you for having me.